persons only. So what we're seeing here, not to corporations, puts that little warning. So basically, whenever you see the word individual in a statute, it means a natural person, for most part, unless it's redefined. Okay? So that's our base of going into the legal world and looking at it. Now let's go to the Income Tax Act. We saw this earlier. Individual means a person other than a corporation. Really quite ambiguous, right? So, well, here's your first question. If they wanted it to mean a natural person in the first place, why did they redefine it? Okay, so that's one question you can ask. But let's go down to this other thing we looked here. Excise Tax Act. Individual means a natural person. But you see how clear this is? Why didn't they do that there? Okay, they know these principles of interpretation. They know the rules and the laws they have to follow. We looked at this before the break. 15.2b primarily. Where an enactment contains an interpretation section or provision, it must, by law, be read and construed as being applicable to all other enactments relating to the same subject matter unless a contrary intention appears. So when we understand this law here, we can start looking and seeing their thinking behind here. Because here's a great question on this one. Why would they define a word to what it normally means in law? Why would they do that? Waste ink? Why wouldn't they just put this into here? When you understand this, what they're saying here is if this word, or this word by law, would mean the same thing in this act if it was not redefined. And vice versa. This word by law would mean the same thing in this act unless it was redefined. So because this word doesn't mean a natural person, they had to go and put the redefine individual back to its normal legal meaning to stop this meaning from drifting in. Okay? And then they actually had to put something in here to stop this meaning from drifting in. So you can see by following the rules, you can actually see why they're wasting ink. It's not waste. They know the laws. So that's one you can play with and have fun with. It's you can start seeing the logic, the intent behind their drafting. Now again, let's go back to use that innocent perception, just the form of proof. Just look how easy it is for them to say what they want to mean. We saw this earlier, the Bank Act. Person means a natural person, an entity, personal representative. If we were in there, do you think they could afford a few more letters and ink for letters to put it in there? We're not in there because we can't be in there. They know it. They've known it for years. They just tried to convince us we were by getting us to forget, not teaching us who we were. Okay, pulling that out of our legal system. But again, here we can go a little bit more complex. Remember, anything in the illusion, you will be able to find it written down. So basically what we said here is you have to work as an officer in an office or employment to receive, in order to make taxable income for the taxpayer. Right? And income is just the consideration or partial for that, holding that office. If that holds true, we should be able to find a section within statutes to support that. And it's there. Okay? It's section 6.3 out of the Income Tax Act. By understanding principles of interpretation, you'd never even get past 6.3 of the Income Tax Act before you realize what it was. But again, this is something you can have fun with your accountant, but it's not their fault. Okay? One of our educators is an accountant. He's been a CA for 30 years, and we were having an educators meeting about this and dissecting it. We spent a couple hours on this anyways, but he goes, wow, I've been a CA for 30 years, and I've never been able to understand that. Because when we can accept accountants are not taught principles of interpretation. Section 6.3 goes basically the amount received by one person from another during the period while the payee was an officer of or in the employment of the payer on account in lieu of payment or in satisfaction of an obligation arising out of the agreement made by the payer with the payee immediately prior to, during, or immediately after the payee was an officer of or in the employment of the payer shall be deemed for purposes of Section 5. You got that? That's why it says a couple hours we could spin it. But basically you look at it, payee and payer are neutral words. This allows, in payee we can put in a natural person, but being payer, technically an officer, a natural person can have a business and hire one officer for the government. You'd still have to do payroll, but so it allows for both. But let's look at the payee side. During the period of time while the natural person was an officer, okay, or after the period that the natural person was an officer of a payer, shall be deemed, so the amount he's receiving while he's an officer shall be deemed for Section 5. And what's Section 5? Section 5, subject to a taxpayer's income for a taxation year from an office or employment. Okay? So we realize, well, you as a natural person are performing duties of an officer, whatever you make shall be deemed to be taxable income for the taxpayer for the taxation year, okay, to be remuneration for the payee services rendered as an officer. The natural person services rendered as an officer. Or during the period of employment, unless it is established. So what you're seeing here is a default benefit system. The default benefit is CPP, but the obligation is the income tax. So what they're saying is, unless it's established otherwise, everything you make shall be deemed to be remuneration you made performing the duties of an officer. Okay? Unless it is established that irrespective of the agreement, if any, under which the amount we received was made or the former legal effect thereof, it cannot reasonably be regarded as being received. Got that? As consideration or partial consideration for accepting the office or entering into the contract of employment. So just even accepting the office, which really is your self-employed area. Okay? As remuneration or partial remuneration for services as an officer, your employee. In consideration or partial consideration for a covenant with reference to what the officer is, officer-employee synonyms, is or is not to do before or after the termination. So whether you have the job or not, you're in the job or not, anything you're supposed to do before or after still lumped under as consideration, which then picks up all these fees and everything else. They got us coming and going, left, right, before we even start work, after work, whatever. It is, and in the law, you can create, in an illusion, you can create no boundaries. Gravity does not exist in an illusion. That is what income tax is, and that's where it's, in the Act it says, is everything you make shall be deemed to be taxable income unless you establish otherwise. And that's where your right to free will comes in. That's what we need to look at, is how can you establish otherwise? And that's where you, by understanding your right to contract, your free will, you take back control. It is very easy to establish otherwise. Okay, the right to contract, which is really another way of saying your free will, with both natural and artificial persons having the right to contract, and a variety of contractual agreements can be formed. Artificial people can contract with artificial people. Artificial with natural. Natural with natural. And natural with artificial. So really, it just keeps, we sometimes can't see the difference unless we slow down and see what's really going on and who we're really connected with. Now again, anything artificial, you'll be able to find it written down. So an artificial person's right to contract, we should be able to find it within statute. If the creator is the government, it'll be in the statute. So in Canada, such rights can be found in the Interpretation Act under the heading of corporations. And what is corporations in federal statutes unless redefined? Artificial persons. So now when we interject the right word into here so we can understand it, in section 21(1) of the Federal Interpretation Act, words establishing an artificial person shall construed as vesting in the artificial person power to sue and be sued, and power to contract and be contracted with by its corporate name. And that is the only difference really between, not all entities, because some entities are created with less rights, but basically a generic entity has as much right to contract as you do, except for it has to do it in its corporate name, and we can do it in any name we want, because that's our right. And this is where, when we talked about capitalization, I said for the most part they don't follow and adhere to the 3 levels of capitalization until it gets to the point of contract. And that's why when I got to court and all my court papers, the summons was a contract, the lay of information was a contract. Then you started seeing them adhere to it a little bit more. So sometimes you get a letter from CCRA, it's upper and lower case, it's because it's not a final contract phase stage of it, it's just a communication. Okay? So that's their right to contract. Now, a natural person's right to contract has the right to contract because upon our birth we're endowed with the gift of free will and the natural right of self-determination. How many people here have ever been in an employment situation where the government walks in and says, I deem you an employee? Right? Or you're an employer and says, no, I deem all your self-employed people as employees. Well, where'd they get that right? They got the right because people don't know who they are, and the government's actually walking in deeming all their officers. See, when you're inside this box, your master can come in and say, no, no, we're going to tell you which side of the line you're on. But when you're outside this box, nobody has the right to deem you anything, okay? Because you have the right to self-determination. Now, this right can be exercised with or without knowledge, okay? To enter into legally binding contracts. The responsibility and the choice is yours. See, you're already using your free will, and you're entering into things you're not aware of. That's what I mean. They know as long as we don't have the knowledge, they'll always have the upper hand. They'll just set the game board up. Okay? And here's some recognition of and protection of it. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that is so powerful because when you see one person in this country doing something, that means we're all allowed to do it. Again, you can spend months contemplating that. And again, we see this Sang Chong case, okay, among the normal rights, the natural rights, which are an unmolested pursuit of one's trade or occupation. So when CCR walks in and tries to deem you something, that's a molestation of your occupation. Where'd they get the right? But that is not the taxpayer's right. That is your human right. And when you're structured properly, they now come into force. So and it goes on to say, where restraint is sought to be put upon any person in respective exercise of any of those natural rights, I think it's the duty of the court to assume that the legislature did not intend to interfere with them unless clear and